East Idaho Newsmakers is brought to you by the Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.
This is East Idaho Newsmakers with Nate Eaton.
Welcome to East Idaho Newsmakers. I'm Nate Eaton. Today we are going to talk about love. We are here with a professor from Idaho State University, Dr. Mona Xue. I know I'm mispronouncing her name, but she recently had a paper published in Scientific American on their website called What Goes On in Our Brains When We Are in Love. And this is something you've studied for quite a few years. The brains and loves. I'm going to read you a little bit about Dr. Xue. Actually, I'm going to call her Dr. X. She said that that's what her students call her, so that I'll have a better time with that. Graduated from New York University in 2005 with a bachelor's, and then graduated from Stony Brook University with a master's and PhD. She has had postdoctoral training at Alpert Medical School, Brown University, and the Miriam Hospital, and has been teaching at Idaho State University since 2013. Her research focuses on cardiovascular and behavioral health, close relationships, especially romantic relationships, and neuroimaging. Dr. X conducts basic research in each of these areas, as well as more applied research in the overlaps. She has also researched the context of individual differences and culture, and she is interested in mentoring and pedagogy. So very accomplished. We're so glad that you're here. So let's just get right to it. What happens to our brains when we are in love?
So a lot of different things happen. I think what most people are interested in is what happens when people fall into that intense early stage love, when you really have that rush for someone else. And typically what we see is activations in reward regions of the brain, so regions that are very dopamine rich. And these are often regions that are very similar to the regions we see in addiction. So a lot of the common sense wisdom and songs and poetry you read about love being a drug, we kind of see that in the brain. Although obviously not everyone has that experience necessarily. And so there's also really interesting activations that happen when we look at more long-term relationships or people who fall in love more slowly. And certainly love in a broader context, so what you might feel towards your family members or even your pets. We also see activation in more attachment-related regions and more serotonin-rich regions.
So is this something that you actually how did you study this? Did you hook people's brains up to machines, and then as they started to date someone or get to know someone, you noticed changes?
No, that is a really interesting way of approaching it, and something that we're hoping to do. But there's actually very little longitudinal research like that, where you follow people over time, in part because of the cost of scanning. For neuroimaging, there's a lot of different methodologies. The one that I've used the most often is fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that's where we put people in the MRI scanner. So people might have been in MRIs for scanning their knees or other things. So that scanner is very good at looking at your anatomy, so what the anatomy of your brain looks like. And then the F piece, the functional piece, is we're looking at blood flow in the brain as people are being asked to do something. And so for us, in the studies that we've done, and many colleagues in this field, what typically happens is we show people an image of the person they've just fallen in love with, and then a control image, an image of someone who is the same sex and age as the person they've fallen in love with, and who they've known for about as long. So there's familiarity there, but they just don't have those special feelings for. And so what we're interested in is, where is the blood flow going in the brain when they're looking at that picture of the person they have special feelings for, as opposed to, so minus the activation of that control image. And what we see are activations in areas like ventral area and caudate and these dopamine-rich regions.
Interesting. So when you're first in love, you have proven that there is a difference in the brain versus someone that may have been married for 5 or 10 years.
Well, that's really interesting, Nate, because some researchers have really looked at this in terms of trying to figure out, is there a huge difference there? And before we had neuroimaging studies, it was really hard to tell, because you just ask people, right? And it's really hard to tell, well, if people say, I'm just as in love as I was 30 years ago, is that true? Are they, maybe optimistic about it?
Is it a different type of love?
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of my colleagues, Bianca Acevedo, she actually did the first neuroimaging study of long-term intense passion love, so people who have been married for 20, 30 years and claim to still feel those butterflies and still feel the same way as when they first fell in love. And when she put these people in the scanner and looked to see what their activations looked like, they looked very similar to activations of people who had just fallen in love.
Really? So it was, if they said that, it was,
they were telling the
truth.
They hadn't deceived themselves. So she saw the same activations in caudate and VTA, but she also saw a lot of other regions too, which we would expect. So regions that more associated with attachment, some really nice activations in serotonin-rich brainstem regions, which might help explain, for example, why high-quality long-term relationships are really beneficial to mental health and buffer against depression and those sorts of things. And then it also mapped on really nicely to interviews with those people, talking about, yes, I think I still feel those butterflies for my partner, but I also don't feel some of the more negative things that you might feel in the beginning. I no longer worry, do they return my affections, etc. I no longer get clammy palms when I'm trying to call them or something like that, which is good, because after 20 or 30 years, you probably don't want to be, stuttering every time you call your partner.
Yeah. What happens to the brain when you fall out of love?
So so I don't know if we've had too many studies looking at people who no longer love their partners, but what we have had are studies, Art Aaron, Lucy Brown, and Helen Fisher have done these studies that were, really kudos to the participants of those studies, because they were studies of people who had just been dumped, so who were still very much in love with the person, but no longer with the person. Mm-hmm. And you see actually very similar activations, because they're still highly wanting to get back with the person. And I say kudos to those participants, because in the scanner you have to hold very still. You can think about it like an old-timey camera where any movement will blur the images and make them unusable. So I know those scans were very tough in terms of the instructions being like, you can cry, you might cry because we're going to show you pictures of the person who just dumped you, mm-hmm. but you can't move your head.
Do you know if there's a response to the brain? For instance, we hear of people who die from broken heart syndrome, where a loved one suddenly dies and then, a few months or weeks later, their spouse passes away or a girlfriend. Is there something that's similar that might happen in the brain, where a sudden loss of someone you love so much changes things?
Yeah, there's certainly studies looking at bereavement, and certainly things like depression might come about during grief. Matt Lieberman also has a wonderful set of studies where he looks at social pain, so the pain we feel when we're rejected or when we have some sort of social loss. And a lot of activations we see during social pain is very similar to physical pain. So there's a lot of overlap in those systems, and that might be one of the mechanisms that explain sort of physical symptoms when we have more psychological distress.
What got you interested in this?
I was interested mostly because I was interested in studying romantic relationships in general. And what really struck me, so the burning question I had when I started grad school was whether or not romantic love is experienced universally. And at the time, there was very little neuroimaging research in romantic love. So social neuroscience, the study of social relationships and social variables using neuroimaging techniques, that's only been around since about 2000, so it's a very new field. And so when I started grad school, we didn't really know, in terms of love universality, anything other than mostly self-report measures. And so it was really hard to tell what to make of the general consensus. So the general consensus in the cultural literature was that Westerners, those in individualistic cultures like the US, feel love very strongly, are very passionate. If you ask them what love is, they'll write about very positive things. It's euphoria, it's all these wonderful things. And then when you do those same studies in Eastern cultures like China or Japan, you get much lower responses. People don't write about passion as much, they report lower levels of that. And they also write about more negative things or more pragmatic things, right? Being in a relationship for financial reasons or stability. And so it's really difficult when you have just those self-reports to figure out, is it that these are very different experiences that we're hearing about, right? Love is culturally specific. Or is it that maybe the experience of love is actually quite similar across culture, but how we talk about it is influenced by culture. So maybe in the East, you're taught to be a little bit more modest and humble. Maybe you're a little uncomfortable talking about, these feelings you have for someone else. And maybe even in the West, we're taught to amplify, and that, if you're in love, you're supposed to want to shout it from the rooftops and jump on Oprah's couch and these sorts of things, right? And so I was trying to think of, is there a way we can get around the asking people about it? Because it's really difficult to know what that experience is really like outside of the context of how they talk about it to others and themselves, which is very much influenced by culture. And I think that cultural difference is interesting, but I was really interested in, can we look at it biologically or some other route? And so I got involved in fMRI through that, because my advisor at the time in grad school, Aaron, had just completed the first fMRI study for early stage intense passion love in the US. And so I said, why don't I go to China and replicate it and see what it looks like there? So I spent a summer in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and working with Xu Wang, who opened the first fMRI lab in China, and learning those techniques because I knew nothing about it at the time. And we replicated it, and when we compared those results, it was really striking how incredibly similar they were with Chinese students versus American students. And so, it helped us.
So were there differences in the cultures?
Not particularly, no.
We all handle love, or our brains handle love pretty much the same.
Very similarly, yes. And then since then, there have been some really wonderful papers that have come out, again, looking at potential differences and trying to figure out how universal this is. So Zeki and Ramaya have a wonderful paper where they look at gender and sexuality, and they show that it's fairly similar across those as well. So we have this, at the experiential level, it seems to be quite similar regardless of gender, sexuality, cultural background, but of course how we talk about it is very much influenced by these things.
Now, were you born and raised in New York?
I was raised in New York. I was born in China, and I moved to the US when I was 5.
When you were 5. And as a child, were you always kind of interested in research and learning things? What kind of led you down this path?
Yeah, I think I was always very curious. I have wonderful parents who always supported education. My dad is a computer science professor.
In China?
Yeah, he's in Beijing. And so, he was always asking me fun questions. And I think I was also very curious, having moved. I think my first experiment wasn't a very good experiment, but my first scientific experiment, I think, was when they told me about the tooth fairy. And I was very confused about it because I'd never heard about it when I was in China. And so I think when I lost a tooth, I put it under my pillow but didn't tell them. And nothing happened.
Nothing happened.
And then the next day I told them, and then I got, $1 or something. And I was like, oh.
Smart. And how old were you? Like 7 or 8?
Yeah, something like that.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a quick break here. I want to talk more about the feeling you had in your brain when your paper got published, and what's next for you and some of the other work you've done down at ISU. So we'll be right back.
At the Bank of Commerce, we understand the hard work, determination, and sacrifice it takes to run a successful business. That's why we're here every step of the way to help make your dreams come true. The Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.
Welcome back to East Idaho Newsmakers. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Mona Xue, Dr. X, with us. She is a professor at Idaho State University who recently had one of her papers studied in Scientific American on their website called What Goes On in Our Brain When We Are in Love. So we talked a little bit before the break about that. You've also studied behavioral health, cardiovascular, the impact of physical activity, weight control, things like that. What would you say is the main takeaway you've learned in your years of researching that?
It's really important to try to live in a healthy manner. Preventative medicine is incredibly important. If you can engage in behaviors like eating well and being physically active regularly that prevent you from developing illnesses, that's a lot more helpful than trying to, not more helpful, but it's a little easier than trying to deal with it once things have really progressed quite far. I think also, having done a little more clinical work in this sense and working with people who are going through, let's say, weight loss interventions, It's really important to be compassionate towards yourself and not to beat yourself up if 1 week you don't lose as much weight as you were hoping to, and to really try to figure out what will work for you and your lifestyle. So there's no one size fits all, unfortunately. Everyone would love to find a magic bullet kind of, here you take this pill and you're healthy forever.
Yeah, can you create that? Because you'd be a millionaire, you'd be set.
I would.
Yeah.
A lot of people are working on it, but I just don't think we're going to reach a point where that happens. And so it's really important to figure out what is the level of health that you can achieve without having to completely compromise your lifestyle, right? So you don't want someone to have to only eat things that they hate and work out 5 hours a day and do things that they really don't want to do, because that's one, probably not going to be able to be sustained long term, but two, quality of life is also really important. And so, for physical activity, for example, if you just hate going to the gym, you don't have to go to the gym. Find something that you like doing, if it's walking with your friends or attending a Zumba class. Or if, maybe your health isn't great and physical activity just isn't going to work out for you, well, can you reduce your sedentary behavior? Can you just stand up and walk around the room for a couple of minutes, just every hour or so, and so you aren't sitting at your desk for 10 hours like many of us do. Mm-hmm. So what are the little tweaks that you can do to make yourself healthier and also be able to have a life that you want to keep living? And then the social psychologist in me always likes the overlap between social psychology and health psychology, because we know how important it is to have high quality relationships, to have a social network of people that we can rely on when we need support, and also to improve our own well-being by having friends and family and close others that we can turn to in times of need, but also celebrate good things with. And so if you can nurture those relationships, that's also very beneficial to physical health as well.
Is there a difference in the brain when you love someone you're romantically interested in versus a child, versus one of your children or a parent?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we're starting to get a better sense of. So certainly you wouldn't expect to see activation areas associated with sort of erotic content or lust. But in terms of reward regions being activated and then more attachment-based regions being activated, you would expect to see quite similar results. And certainly when we think about analogies of trying to describe to someone, so let's say someone had never fallen in love with a romantic partner before, how would you describe that? Oftentimes the things that people will tell us are, seeing my child for the first time when they're born, like that rush, or those of us who maybe have fur babies that are very attached to them, seeing pictures of our pets or our very, very close friends, or some memory of a time that was incredibly important and meaningful and happy for us. And so there is a lot of overlap there without the sexual component. And there's some researchers who are also kind of extending it to think about, can we see similar activations even with, say, unconditional love towards a stranger, right? When we think about humanity, or we think about trying to help someone who might need our help.
Is there a difference between love versus lust? Someone that you might not love, but you have sexual relations with, or you view pornography. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not really loving that person. I would imagine there may be something different happening in the brain when that occurs, maybe? Yeah,
so they can, of course, both happen. You can have both, or one without the other. Certainly, so when we think about love, it can be conceptualized in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that we think about it is it tends to be very motivated towards one specific person. So it's not necessarily, I have a sexual desire that I want to fulfill, and maybe any attractive person would be able to do that. It's usually focused on one person where, I want to have a sense of union with this person. I want to really know them and have them know me and maybe build a life with them, or however you might feel. And that's usually not very easily transferable, where you can say, I don't like love this person anymore. I love this person and all. And a lot of people have a hard time when a relationship doesn't work out of trying to restart.
Good point. Good point. So tell us how you ended up in Idaho.
Well, after my postdoc, or towards the end of my postdoc, I started applying for jobs, and I applied for a number of them, and I was lucky enough to get a few offers. But when I came out here to visit for my interview, I just fell in love with the mountains, and the people here are just phenomenal, and my department is fantastic. I have, at the time, Shannon Lynch was our chair, and now it's Michelle Brumley, and they're both amazing. Candy Charlie Ames is our dean and of the College of Arts and Letters, and all of them, the administration has just been so supportive. And meeting with the graduate students, especially when I interviewed, they really blew me away. They're just some of the smartest and hardest working and just genuinely nice people I'd met, and so I really thought, I want to come here and work with them. And so one of them, Ariana Tart-Zelvin, for example, wrote that article with me, and it's just it's such a privilege to work here and work with the graduate students and undergrads, and just this amazing department of really, really brilliant, cool people to work with.
And you've been here 5 years now?
Yes, this is my 5th year.
4 or 5 years. Have you noticed changes as a professor in maybe the undergrads, I guess the millennial generation, as far as work ethic or passion?
That's interesting. I don't think I have. Although I will say, I think for ISU we have a really good student population because it's very mixed. Like we have a lot of non-traditional students who are parents or work or are in the military or are firefighters or something like that, and they take online courses or they're coming back to school after a time. So we have a good mix. It's not just 18 to 22-year-olds, right? So I haven't seen much of that.
Before we end, I want to ask, how important is having love just in each of our lives?
Well, I think it's quite important. Of course, everyone's a little different. I think regardless of whether or not you're in romantic relationships, having really strong feelings of connection is really important for mental health as well as physical health. And that can be thought of very broadly. So it could be friends and family, it could be connection spiritually, but just something to help you feel like you're not alone, and also to have a network that you can turn to, whether it's online or offline or what have you, when you need help, and to be able to be supported enough and to feel welcomed and loved enough that you don't put off seeking help when you need it.
What did you feel? Well, first of all, walk us through the process of getting something published. So you do a lot of research, obviously, and how often are you publishing your papers?
I publish a few a year.
A few a year, and then do you submit them to magazines and publications in hopes that they'll get picked up?
No, so typically, when I submit, we typically submit to academic journals, and then there's a peer review process. For this, I'm trying to remember how it happened. So usually what ends up happening is those academic articles, media gets interested in them, or some of them more than others.
This one, yeah.
Yeah, Love in the Brain, media tends to like, and then they contact me. So I've done interviews, or people quote me in various publications. And then occasionally I will have editors who will ask if we'll write a little piece, and so that's something that happened here.
And what are you working on now? What can we see in the future? Can you divulge that?
Oh, geez. I'm working on a lot of different things. There are several really exciting dissertation studies that we're hoping will get published. Well, some are still in the works and some are being written up. So Ariana Tart-Zelvin, for example, who co-wrote this with me, has a wonderful dissertation study where she did brain imaging down in Salt Lake of people either assigned to use a rehearsal strategy or not, in terms of working memory and memorizing words. And what she was able to find was that those who were taught to use the rehearsal strategy not only did a lot better in terms of how many words they were able to remember, but actually showed more efficient brain use. So they used less of their brain to do better at this cognitive task. So that's one thing that we're very excited to try to push out, and we're submitting fairly soon, I think.
What are some things that, and this might not be the question for you, it might be for somebody else, but I'm in my mid-30s. What are some things that somebody my age or younger or even a little older could do to keep your brain active? Everyone worries about getting Alzheimer's disease or dementia when you get older, or having your brain go to waste. Is there anything that has been proven that we can do now that will help us maybe avoid that later?
Sure, there's a lot of different things you can do, and a lot of them just fit into a healthy living kind of package. So physical activity is very much linked to better brain functioning and less structural damage down the line. So if you can engage in regular physical activity, the recommendation is about 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity, like swift walking, or 75 minutes of intense, vigorous activity like running, or some combination of that. Strength training is also helpful there as well. And social relationships, having high quality social relationships, getting enough sleep and getting enough high quality sleep consistently, and eating well. Those are some of the things that we're fairly convinced are helpful.
Well, we're really lucky to have you in East Idaho.
Thank you.
At Idaho State University, and we appreciate you coming in here for East Idaho Newsmakers. We'll put a link in the article below to Dr. Xu's article about what goes on in our brain when we are in love, and we also you have a website, or is that just for students?
No, I have a lab website.
Yeah, we'll stick that up too if you're interested in finding more about her. And Mona, we wish you the best, and we hope to see many more papers in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in here. Have a good week.
East Idaho Newsmakers is brought to you by the Bank of Commerce, your bank of a lifetime.